We're going to just hold off until November when we get everything.
Yeah.
Treasurer's report will be the same because Hope is not here this evening, so we will get the full report. All I'll say in general is there's $100,000 in the bank. We have money. We haven't broken yet, so we're still doing okay respectively. Couple of things to announce. There are some volunteer opportunities. I know some were mentioned in the newsletter. There's a couple others that have just recently come up. 1973 was when the Heritage Act was first passed. So next year is the 50th anniversary of the Heritage Act, which led to our designation process across Alberta, etc. If anyone would like to do some research on that act in a very specific way, let me know. There is some editing. There's a new walking tour that needs some editing and a few other things. So if you're interested in anything like that, let myself or any member of the executive know. Just today, if anybody's paying attention to the news, Lethbridge City Council officially designated the Oliver Building. So it became a municipal historic resource today and means the 28th municipal designation in the city of Lethbridge. So we're up on those. And we just found out, I think some of you know that we are working with the city on an interpretive sign that will go on 2nd Avenue South, right by the Scotia Bank. We just got confirmation that that will be fully paid for by our partners, and that should be going into the designer in the next little while. It is being created in Texas by a caliber design company because they can get a better material down there that will last longer. So we're hoping we'll get it back in a month. So look for that interpretive sign to be going up in the next month and a half. And it tells the story of that area of town, which if you know anything about the Coolies to 5th Street, 1st Avenue to 3rd Avenue, is a very fun history and was really hard to fit on just one sign because we wanted to tell a lot more of that history. So that should be going up hopefully beginning of November. If they put it up this year, if not, we'll let you know if it's going into 2023. We just want to get it into this year's budget. So those are just some of the things we're working on and things you can help us work on as we move ahead. Is there any other announcements that anyone has that I have failed to share? If I failed to share, it's because I don't know about it. So, all right. Then we will call this meeting, short meeting, to close, and we will hand it over to Lori to introduce our guest speaker.
Thank you, Belinda. So for those of you who don't know, my name is Lori Johansson. I'm currently the Vice President of Historical Society. And we have come back to our in-person meetings, which means we get speakers in person. So today we have Stewart Foss. Stewart Foss works professionally as a user experience web designer at the University of Lethbridge. He has volunteered for over 10 years on the board of the Raymond Historical Society. He also spent about 10 years on Raymond's Historic Resource Committee, which works to identify and preserve historic properties in the community. He recently completed a term on town council and was able to chair that committee during that time and help designate Raymond's first 2 municipal historic resources. You have a bit of catching up to do. Well, 28. But 2 is a good start. Since his term on council ended last year, he has resumed part-time studies at the U of L, working towards a history degree with a minor in religious studies. His research interest is primarily in Mormon settlement patterns, particularly in southern Alberta. He and his wife enjoy volunteering together, serving on the boards of the Friends of the Raymond Public Library and the Raymond Free Pantry Society together. They also have 4 children. And Stewart's topic of the presentation this evening is Prohibition in the Mormon country of southern Alberta. Stewart, if you would like to do it. Prohibition, there's coffee. There we go. Are we ready to rock and roll? Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Stewart. Enjoy the presentation.
Sorry, I'll need ample water.
Is it my
Is it on? Is it on? Might have to hold it close here. Is this? Okay. I think I've got it. Can you hear me okay? Okay. So, sorry, too clicky at me. Thanks for having me. I'm thrilled to be here representing the Raymond District Historical Society. The Raymond District Historical Society operates Raymond Pioneers in Raymond, Alberta. It's a short drive if you were looking for an afternoon outing. We are located right in downtown Raymond, Alberta. The society was founded in 1989 and initially worked to create a museum, which it has successfully operated for a few decades now. We also used to manage the town's archives, which in the last couple of years we transferred to the library, which we're managing archives now. And the Pioneer Museum is located in one of Raymond's first two municipal historic buildings. So the old town hall. Sorry, hold the mic. Is that better? Yes. Oh. So if you're looking to come and visit us out in Raymond, we are on winter hours now, which means we're only open for a few hours on Wednesday afternoon. During the summer, we open Tuesday through Saturday from 11 to 5. And admission is very cheap. $2 will get you in. For $10, or $10 for a family, or $5 for an individual, you can buy a membership to our society, which gets you access to the museum year-round. So I should recognize that the bulk of the history that I'm speaking about today takes place in Treaty 7 territory, which is the traditional Blackfoot territory. So I'm referring to this area that I'm talking about today as Mormon country, because historically in a few articles of reference they speak about it in that way. So this could have also been titled The Ongoing History of Prohibition in Mormon Country, because some of you may know that Prohibition has not ended in the Mormon regions of Southern Alberta. This presentation is based initially off of an article I wrote about Jesse Knight, who's the founder of Raymond, and his desire to create a community that was a prohibition community. But I've expanded it considerably and reached into some of the other communities in our region. So without further ado, the preamble. So I'm actually sorry, not even into it. But as mentioned in my introduction, I have an interest in Mormon settlement patterns, and specifically those in Canada. And I should note that I'm using the term Mormon interchangeably with the official name of the church, which is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Even though the church officially prefers the full name of the church and encourages the use of the full name of the church, there's a few reasons that I will be using the term Mormon throughout my presentation. One is that the term encompasses more than just adherence to the church. So it's sort of a cultural group and a group that settled different regions. As well, the church is quite comfortable with the use of that term as it relates to historic things. So the Mormon Trail and Mormon settlement in Southern Alberta is perfectly comfortable. So, so Mormons have always been colonizers and city builders. The image that I'm showing here is what's called the Plat of Zion, which was a city plan developed by the church's founder, Joseph Smith, in 1833. He developed this just 3 years after the church was founded. And the church kind of comes from a restorationist tradition, which means it's like very literal about the end times. and the church was trying to establish the Zion, a city of Zion. And so it may be news to some of you that the Mormon church was founded in New York State, and they experimented with city building in Ohio, Missouri, Illinois, before eventually being sort of persecuted and driven out to Utah, which is where most of us know of the church of nowadays. So these city building efforts generally follow the Plat of Zion to some degree. And the primary characteristics of that is that it's a grid pattern, equally square blocks, lots, spaces on each of those lots for agriculture, so gardens and animals were quite comfortable within the city town limits, wide roads, central religious features. And if you visit some of the Mormon communities in our region here, you will recognize some of those features, the grid patterns, the wide streets. Raymond's Main Street is called Broadway, and if you've ever visited it, you'll see why, because it is expensive. There's parking down the center of it. It's quite large. So this pattern formed the basis of Mormon settlement for about 100 years. I grew up in Sterling, and as you can see from the village of Sterling's original plan, there was a strictness to the Plat of Zion in its development. So in 1989, the village of Sterling was designated as a National Historic Site because it remained and still remains one of the best representations in Canada of the Mormon agricultural village. So it's got many of those features of the Plat of Zion. And here I'm just sort of transitioning to a satellite view of the current village, which it has deviated very little from this original plan. Really, the main deviation is that not all of the roads were built. And I think it's mostly because they had to build about 18 bridges to cross the canal against the So, sorry, this is them side by side, the same bridges. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Raymond's town, original town plan, being from the Raymond Historical Society. Raymond took the Plat of Zion and then added a little, extra, which is what Raymond does. So we took the Plat of Zion and then we dropped on top of that the Paris plan. We had these boulevards that went to the center of the community. You can see the X that's quite visible in the middle of town. Within about 20 years, they abandoned the Paris plan and stuck strictly to the Plat of Zion. So these two are just two of approximately 20 Mormon settlements that were created in southern Alberta between the 1880s and about 1912-ish. Some of you may know Carson, McGrath, Raymond, and Sterling, kind of the big four. There are some settlements you may not associate at the beginning with Mormon settlement, one being Tabor, and Mountain View is another one. And then there's a pile of settlements that just don't exist anymore, like Taylorville, Kimball, Franklin, Caldwell. These are all ghost towns, former communities. Various sources have identified a different number of Mormon settlements. I feel pretty comfortable with 21, though I may get into an argument with other people who've tried to identify all of these settlements. And there's a few reasons that this gets a little murky, is that as you may know, the beginning of a community is not always clearly defined, and the end is not always clearly defined. Some are just a collection of homes in a chapel. You could take Welling as an example of that if you've ever driven towards Waterton on that highway. There's a chapel and a few houses. That's Welling. So here's a list of them. I grouped based on their current status. So at the town level, we have 4: Carson, Raymond, Tabor, McGrath. The village level, Western, Linwood, Spring, Barnwell. And then there's 6 hamlets, which are unincorporated communities within the county region. So these are Kimball, Levitt, Mountain View, Welling. And then there's a few of them that are what we would call ghost towns, in that the number of people living in them is probably less than 25. Some of them, there is nobody living there anymore. So at this point, you're probably asking, what does all this have to do with prohibition in Alberta? And so hopefully I'm laying a foundation here for the rest of the presentation. So one of the tenets of Mormonism is a law of health called the Wilderness. And initially it was thought of as helpful guidance, but by about 1850, it started to be considered more of a commandment than helpful guidance. And by the time Mormon pioneers are coming into southern Alberta, it's firmly in the commandment column. And you'll see, I've highlighted, this is my emphasis, that any man that drinketh wine or strong drink of wine, behold, it is not good. So that's where Mormonism stands on this. So moving into chapter 1, that's the let's all just not phase. So though there are about 15 continuing Mormon communities in South Alberta, these 4 here kind of drive as the centers of power when it comes to, well, a few things, but certainly around Prohibition. And you could probably argue it's mostly about Carson. I'm sure people from Carson would argue that it's mostly about that. So Carson starts in 1887, and it started by a man named Charles Orcutt. And he was a member of the church living in Utah, and at the time the church practiced polygamy, he was practicing polygamist. And it was illegal in the United States at that point, and so he was evading persecution. He was a prominent member of the church there, and so the church started looking for other areas where they could settle and perhaps continue to practice their religion without the same persecution that they're feeling in Utah. And the suggestion came from the president of the church at the time, who was a man by the name of John Taylor, who was a British citizen who had joined the church in Canada, in Eastern Canada. And he thought that perhaps Canada would be a better place. And so he sent a car up to kind of explore and try to find a location. They went to BC, they looked around Calgary, and ultimately chose a location in southern Alberta along the Lees Creek, right next to the tribe. So at this point, legally establishing prohibition probably wasn't exactly necessary in these pioneer Mormon settlements. I haven't found any evidence at this point that there was any legal action taken to establish it. But the vast majority of the settlers at this time would have been members of the church. And I'm not sure there would have been much of a market for liquor in those communities anyway. And more than anything, it was likely just sort of a social norm that it wasn't sold and purchased, those things. But between 1898 and 1901, so we're moving a few years down the road, from 1887 when Carson was founded to 1898, when the focus of Mormon migration in Canada becomes about irrigation and irrigation projects. So at this point, polygamy has been discontinued in the church. So that's no longer a drive for people to come here. And instead, the church had worked with the Galts and the Canadian Northwest Irrigation Company to create an irrigation project in the South. And so from the church perspective, this provided followers in Utah an opportunity to have jobs and work. Utah was starting to get a little crowded, and so there was an opportunity to send people up there and sort of spread out a little bit. For the church as well, it provided some international reach and supported some Zion building efforts. Right? For the Canadian officials, it helped establish southern Alberta as a feasible agricultural area. And it also helped bring settlers and for the Galts for them to dispose of some land they got through railway grants. So, so the contract not only required labor of the church, but it also required the church to settle 2 communities in southern Alberta. And those communities needed to have 250 residents, and they had to be at that point by December 31st, 1899. So these communities are become Sterling and McGrath. Unfortunately, the contract was not very successful at drawing settlers. They hoped it would draw settlers from Utah to Canada, and it just didn't work. I don't know if I look at this and I think, well, maybe that's why it wasn't successful in attracting laborers, because that doesn't look like the kind of labor I would want to come to Canada to do. But most of the earlier laborers for the project ended up coming just from the local region, so Cardston, Mountain View, in that area. So they got creative in trying to draw people here. There was a concerted advertising and public relations campaign in Utah, talking about the exciting opportunities in Canada. The Ogden Daily Standard went so far as to describe Canada as the Mecca of Mormon converts. The church hired LHS Jacobs to travel throughout Utah, telling people about how wonderful it would be to work on the canals. And ultimately, even that wasn't enough to attract the settlers that they needed. And so at this point, the church decided in order to fulfill that contract, they were going to have to issue some assignments or calls to members of the church. So there's a long tradition in the LDS faith of missions and people being called on missions. And so the prophet of the church, the leader of the church, would send a letter to people and say, you've been called to labor on the canals in Canada. And so they go up. And for some people, that was a temporary calling. They would just go up and they would work on the canals, and when they were done, they could return to their homes in Utah. But for some, that was kind of a permanent assignment to come to Canada and live in these communities. And for those people that did come, the payment or the contract mimicked the church's contract, which is that they were paid partly in money and partly in land. So just as a quick reminder about time, this is those founding of those communities in chronological order. So we are Sterling and McGrath are created about 12 years after Christ. But they also predate Raymond by about 2 years. So in comes chapter 2, which is the covenant. So what these communities add in the prohibition space is a thing called the restrictive covenant. So a restrictive covenant is a covenant placed on the title of a property, imposing restrictions on the use of the land. And so it's a tool within our legal system to allow you to restrict the future use of a piece of property. And the intent of it is to ensure that people purchasing land would enjoy the same things that the original purposes were intended, right? So the church felt that the value and enjoyment of living in these communities could only be preserved by restricting the property's usage from a host of activities that they didn't want people engaging in. So we have to move so I can read this. But so what this contract is, a contract between the property purchaser and the previous property owner, as well as any other parties to that. And it says that no building, tent, or erection now in or upon said premises, or that may hereafter be placed upon or erected thereon, shall at any time be used or occupied as a place wherein intoxicating liquor is sold, whether by license or otherwise, or a house or place of prostitution, or for any other immoral or illegal purpose. And that breach of this contract, the property would revert to the previous owner, which in this case is the president of the High Council of the Alberta State Presiding, which is the legal organization of the church in Canada. So, there we have our intoxicating liquor. This is the sort of first adventure into prohibition. But there are other activities here, and number 3 is really so wide-reaching that I think you could probably come up with all kinds of reasons to take people's property if you really wanted to go that far. So, to my knowledge, they never did. So with this, the introduction of the restricted covenant, I'm going to shift a little bit to the focus of Raymond, which is kind of where my background and expertise is. And we should do that, right? Even with the creation of Sterling McGrath and all of the propaganda around that, people still weren't flocking. So, so the church was engaged in Utah in the business of sugar. And there's a whole presentation you could do on that. Academic papers have been written about it. But the church is engaged in this business of sugar. So this idea of growing and refining sugar in Alberta comes pretty early to a man by the name of John W. Taylor. Now, I think I mentioned that the church is governed by a prophet with 2 counselors and then a group of 12 apostles, so the council of 12 apostles. Among those apostles is a man by the name of John W. Taylor, and he lives in Canada at this time. And so he was aware of the church's interests in sugar. He was aware of the fact that in about 1890, the church helped fund the sugar factory in Lehigh, Utah. And so as soon as the irrigation project was finished, him along with Charles A. McGrath, who you may know as the Gulf Land Commissioner and eventual mayor of Lethbridge and member of Parliament and all of those things that he did, they distributed sugar beet seeds throughout southern Alberta in the irrigated regions that they just created to prove that you could grow sugar beets here. And it worked. They grew beets, they sent them to Utah, they tested them for some sugar content, and it was good. There was good sugar content in them. So then they started trying to find somebody who would build a sugar processing factory in Canada. And Taylor connected McGrath with a few people, and it didn't really go anywhere. But what they were looking for is, and I quote, a man of substantial means that would be able to do this. And the man that comes up is a man by the name of Jesse Knight. So Jesse Knight was rich, you know, like Elon Musk rich, I don't know, Bill Gates rich, maybe. Certainly philanthropic like Bill Gates. I think probably a better equivalent would be like Mitt Romney rich. So pretty rich, right? And he was well thought of in Utah because he was so generous with his wealth. And they called him Uncle Jesse, which not this Uncle Jesse, but they called him Uncle Jesse in Utah because of how generous he was with his wealth. And you know, all good superheroes need origin stories. So this is maybe a little light because it is a religious backstory for Jesse Knight, but he came to his wealth through what he felt was a revelation. Right? He heard a voice from heaven that told him where to go mine, and when he found ore there, he knew that he'd been led by God to it, and that he should use that money to benefit people. And so he becomes a very, very generous, and I should say benefit people, but specifically he felt it should benefit members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So within a few years of becoming wealthy, the prophet of the church issued a statement which says, "Men and women of wealth, use your riches to give employment to the laborer. Take the idle from the crowded centers of population and place them on the unfilled areas that await the hand of industry. Unlock your vaults, unloose your purses, embark on enterprises that will give work to them employed," and it goes on. And Jesse Knight felt like this message was directed at him, and frankly, it may have been directed at him. And so he carried a copy of this in his pocket for the rest of his life. He had a copy of this message. He would show it to people. He told Charles A. McGrath about this message. And I don't want to say people used it against him, but it created opportunities for people to help him find opportunities to use this to benefit people. So because he was religiously drawn to this, he had come from a place where he wasn't faithful. He heard this voice and became faithful. He said before that time he had been drawn to intoxicants and card playing, and he cast those things off when he heard this. And so that plays into the way he uses his money. And he was motivated by these religious convictions. And it made him feel like he had a responsibility to make sure that the money that he had been led to wasn't used in ways that were counter to the teachings of the church. So over his life, he established 3 communities, each of which were the side effects of business ventures he was doing. So Nightville and Spring Canyon in Utah were related to his mining ventures. And then Raymond in Canada was related to his sugar industry his work in the sugar industry. And one researcher who wrote about this, Gary Reese, Fuller Reese, described his community building methods as paternalistic, right? So he took a really detailed interest in kind of like a father in how these communities were developed. So Knightville, in Knightville, he established prohibition in the form of an employment contract. So if you worked for the Knight Company and everybody in Knightville worked for the Knight Company, then the deal was, I'm going to pay a little bit more, I'm going to give you a little more employment benefits, and in return, I reserve the right to, and I quote, summarily discharge men who are found spending their wages for drink and neglecting the support of their families. So he reserved the right to let you go if you were spending your money on drinks and things like that, right? So that was Knightville. That was his methods to establish prohibition in Knightville. In Spring Canyon, which came about 10 years after that, what he did instead there is he refused to sell or lease property to anyone who had intentions of using it for opening a liquor store or a bar or a licensed restaurant, anything like that. So his bent for prohibition was well known when he was being attracted to Canada. And this is from a parliamentary debate in Ottawa, right? So Dr. William Saunders was responding to questions from parliamentarians about Jesse Knight. And he just laid it out. Mr. Knight's imparting prohibitions and is having clause put into each of the deeds of sale, providing that in case of the establishment at any time, any saloon or drinking place upon his property, such property shall be forfeited and revert to the original owner, which you'll recognize as a restricted covenant. Oh, yeah, something. So we get more restricted covenants, but these are the Jesse Knight flavor of the restricted covenant. So Elizabeth King, an early Raymond historian, described this. She said Knight wished to be, in a sense, Raymond to be, in a sense, a protected sanctuary for families where they could be reared in a religious and wholesome environment. So he had it put into the town charter that any purchased property would have a restricted covenant placed on it. And the primary difference between these ones and the ones for Sterling and McGrath is that the other party in these cases was the Canadian Northwest Irrigation, which is the Gulf Company goals. Which these restrictive covenants are still in place. And I guess I'll get to that, but this company no longer exists, although I think the assets of it are perhaps owned by CP Real, maybe somebody else knows. But the company no longer exists, and yet these companies live on. So this is all happening before prohibition was cool. And what I mean by that is before like the province dives deep into prohibition. They were doing this for decades before. So chapter 3 gets us to the local option. So the idea of a local prohibition area was introduced by the Canada Temperance Act in 1878, right? So this idea that you could have a municipality that would say, we choose not to have restaurants or bars or things selling alcohol was established federally as a thing. What's interesting to me as I've researched this is that none of these Mormon municipalities seem to invoke this act. I mean, the idea is there, but they don't actually use this one. So instead, before Prohibition entered as a provincial and national story, these local option areas were allowed. And at some point before 1915, the province passes a local option act, or I guess at that point it would have been the Northwest Territories passes a local option act, and then establishes licensing regions. And so the province gets divided into a number of different licensing regions. And the Carson licensing district in at least 1901, 1902 looked somewhat like this. So it included Improvement District 79, 38, and then the Municipal District of Cochrane, number 10, and the MD of Sugar City, number 37. So a local option vote is held in December 1901, just months after Raymond is established as a community. So Raymond is established in August 1901, and the region votes on Prohibition in December. And the vote went on the side of being the Prohibition area. So, and for generations, folks in Raymond, there's been lots of urban myths and legends about when Prohibition entered our community. Hat tip to Linda and the work you put into your Prohibition book, because that shed some light for me on when this kind of took place. And so there had been ideas that Raymond, it was a result of a local bylaw, which I've looked at the local bylaws, there's no evidence of any local bylaw in Raymond doing this. And there was also this idea that it was a 100-year ban. And I don't exactly know how that works legally or where the idea even comes from, but I found no evidence of that. So, but this vote did take place in December 1901. And then there were questions about the legitimacy of it almost immediately. So they redid it in the summer of the next year. And again, voted in favor of Prohibition in the region. So a few years later, as local option areas were discussed more generally in the province, and this temperance movement is sort of developing some steam, there was an idea presented in the Calgary paper that there were no local option areas in Alberta, but David Elton, who was the editor of the Cardston paper, the Alberta Star, made clear that there was, in fact, the licensing district number 11, there was a local option area, and it comprises at least 3 of the most prosperous and progressive towns in Alberta, viz. Cardston, Raymond, and Graff. So there you have it. Yes, Prohibition was established through local option in 1902 officially, I guess. So then we fast forward a few years to the less local option, which is 1915, Alberta votes to go dry, province-wide. 1916, it's established through provincial legislation. And then we fast forward to 1923, and it's revoked. And it's revoked is maybe too strong because it really just becomes a different flavor of Prohibition, but there's different restrictions placed on sale. So that is a gross oversimplification of that period of history. But the Mormon areas were just quite content to sort of roll through that. They had Prohibition before it. And as it came to an end, really what happened is that there was concern that they might lose their local option area. And so as they debated this in the legislature, Premier Brownlee said, he was the premier at the time, that there had been an agreement between the Mormon people and the federal government that they should always have the local option right, which I find interesting because we do have that Temperance Act in place in 1970. So this is true. There is, it's not just an agreement with the Mormon people, it's an agreement with all people in Canada that they could have a local option right. But it gets framed as an agreement with the Mormon people. And so as a result, as they work through this, they identify the Mormon areas, and again, it's relying on that local option vote. So ID 7, 8, 9, and 38 plus MDs of number 10 and 37. So the legislation to reintroduce the sale of alcohol was passed in 1924. And interestingly, it did not include this explicit prohibition in these areas. It sort of left that out, but it introduced the idea of local option, again, as a provincial thing. And over the next couple of years, there were many, many local option votes held throughout the province of and I looked and looked and looked for evidence of Raymond, and I was mostly interested in Raymond at this point, that Raymond had a local option vote again after 1924, and I found no evidence that they did have another vote. And so there must have been a feeling that the previous vote from 1902 was sufficient to maintain the local option. So with the legislation revised, it becomes revised in 1953. And at this point, these Mormon areas get baked into the provincial legislation. And I'm not quite sure why, and I haven't really found any documentation of why. But so those areas now get put, and as you can see, it says, notwithstanding any provisions in this act. So no matter what we've said previously in this act, no matter what, you can't sell alcohol in these regions. And so that gets baked into the act in 1953, and it remains in the Alberta Liquor Act until 2020. And that's, and in later iterations, it basically says, refer to section 135-2 of the 1953 for these areas. So all of these ID 7, 8, 9, 38, 10, 37, these cease to exist at some point. They get amalgamated into counties and municipal districts. And so in 2018, I was interested in what this looked like today, or at that time. So I reached out to the LHS and I said, what does this map look like today? And they were like, we don't have a map. I was like, you must have a map. So somebody applies for a liquor license, and it's prohibited in a certain region. How do you know what region? And so eventually they sent me the scanned copy of this map. This was the map they referred to, which roughly is, well, I think it is almost exactly what we saw before. Interestingly enough, I mean, it's all of the county of Cardston, about half, not quite half, a third of the county of Warner, and then it includes a little section of the county of Lethbridge on this map. So it created some, I'm not sure the county of Lethbridge spent much time thinking about this, but for the county of Warner, who I spoke to, it created some complications around land use and then their planning around it. And so I say this remained in the act until 2020 because 2020 is when we get the return of a local option, but an alternative. So 2020 Bill 2 gets passed by the Alberta legislation, which removes that entire notwithstanding, which lists all of IDs and MDs, removes that entire section from the legislation. Just kind of strikes it. And what it does for these communities is it makes them what are called municipalities without license. And so they're effectively treated like a municipality that has never had a license. And that's probably true of all of them. And the way this happened, the way this operated following the changes to the Liquor Act is that now, if you live in one of these communities, you can apply for a liquor license. And then what happens is that liquor license goes to the ALGC, AGLC. I probably transposed it, but and then when they receive that, they know that this is a community without license, and they forward that application to the municipality within which it's applied for. And so that would come to, in the case of Raymond, the Raymond Town Council would see that application. And then the council has 90 days to respond to it. And if they don't respond within 90 days, it's assumed to have been denied, and no new applications can be submitted for 3 years. But they have 90 days in which they could approve that application. And once approved, what that does is it removes the status of being a community without license. And from there forward, Raymond would be a community with license where people could apply for licenses. And so it's sort of a local option in that the communities maintain control over it today, but as soon as one license is granted, then there's no way to revert back to the old way. So what this then creates, I don't know if you guys watched the news about Raymond's, I don't want to call it drama, but there was the discussion around licensing Raymond Ignited last year. And it became a national story because I think mostly because people were shocked to discover that there are still prohibition areas in Canada. That was news. And Raymond had been living in prohibition for 120 years at this point, right? So what the Raymond Town Council decided to do, and they had not received an application for a license, but they decided to kind of get ahead of it. So they did some surveys and sought community feedback to decide what to do in the case of them getting an application. And they weren't the only ones. The Village of Sterling did some surveying to try to understand it. Didn't quite make the national headlines that the Raymond one did. And you may remember that back in 2014, Cardston had a similar exercise. In all three cases, the preference of the local residents was in favor of prohibition. So hence why I say the ongoing history of prohibition in these communities. So they all have opted to maintain prohibition status. But with Bill 2 and the removal of the explicit requirement for there not to be licenses granted in these communities, what it's done is it shifted the responsibility for that decision to the local town council and community or county councils. And so I kind of wanted to get a sense of where they're at today. And to my knowledge, no licenses. Well, I shouldn't say that. I think a couple of licenses were granted. But the communities were a circle with a line, a red circle with a line through it. Those are communities in which, and I scoured through land use bylaws to see if there were any provisions in the land use bylaw that would allow liquor stores, licensed restaurants, hotels serving alcohol, and all of the ones with the circle, red circle line through it for communities where there is no provision in the land use bylaw to it. So I took that as a hint as to where they currently stand on the issue. McGrath has in their land use bylaw provision for licensed restaurants, and that's new since Bill 2 passed 2 years ago. And I don't know if they have any licensed restaurants or not. And then the county, Warner, has allowance for it in hamlets, which may have been there before the changes to the law have been actually. And then the county Cardston, which is the biggest part of that historic prohibition area, has allowances for licensed restaurants, hotels, liquor stores. All of that is outlined in their land use bylaw now, which is again revised within the last 2 years. So I take that as a hint as to where prohibition continues to be in this region. And so that prohibition area has shrunk dramatically down to really just, we're talking about just those villages, town of Raymond, town of Cardston, now, and that all of the county regions now allow it, at least in the land use bylaws. So I'm almost to the end of my presentation. There is a slight epilogue here, which is that in the process of researching this over the last couple of years, I got really interested in this restricted covenant idea. So even though legally, from a provincial standpoint and from a land use and local standpoint, in many of these regions, you could create a licensed restaurant or a liquor store. You might have sitting on your title a restriction against doing that in the form of restricted covenant. Are they enforceable? I don't know, probably not. Nobody's tested it. But I wanted to get a sense of how extensive these were. So I kind of really agree sometimes. And I had a co-conspirator working with me, Kristen Wes, who lives in the Raymond area. What we did is we took the public tax roll data from the town of Raymond, and we dumped it into a spreadsheet. And then we cross-referenced that with the titles, land titles, and just started sort of manually identifying different restricted covenant numbers, which properties had them, and we have created this this enormous spreadsheet. And at the point of creating this, I imagined that Raymond was the only community that had restricted covenants. I've since learned that Sterling and Grath and many of the county regions between Sterling and Grath all have them as well. So there's literally hundreds of properties with these restricted covenants on them. 60% of Raymond's properties have restricted covenants on their titles. And mine included, mine has one. I think most do. And I thought it was really interesting. Then I thought what would be really interesting is to kind of map them. Now, this is just the beginnings of mapping. I wish that I was further along. This is why it's in blog, because that's far from the research project. But I took a few of them and just mapped them for interest's sake to see where they were. And what's interesting about this is there are generally three parties to the restricted covenant. There's the property owner, the current property owner, the historic property owner who placed the restricted covenant, and then there are anyone else who has the same registered document attached to their property, the same restricted covenant. So I don't know how far this will reach. So what surprised me is that like these two properties here, and then this cluster over here, all have the same restricted covenant attached to them. And then you can see a little cluster of yellow down here, and then a big cluster of yellow way up there. And so the map of restricted covenants in Raymond is a tangled web of documents. And so theoretically, you know, if one of these people, so one property owner wanted to apply for a license and open a bar on their property, let's say this little dot here wanted to do it. All of these little dots have a case against them and could take them to court to stop them from doing it. And so, although prohibition is kind of gone in many ways, this I don't imagine there comes a day anytime in the near future where these restricted kind of documents get removed from all of the titles in these communities. It's probably going to be something that's there for all time, as long as the titles exist. So, and oh, I accidentally put that on. That's it. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Question for Stewart. The prohibition and restriction of selling, does it extend to possession of alcohol?
So the question is, with the restriction against selling, does that extend to possession?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I'm doing that for the Zoom connected people. No, it doesn't. Possession is not. Was never prohibited. Just really distribution, selling was all that was ever prohibited, and that's true today. Even with the restricted covenant, if you look at the restricted covenant, personal use isn't really prohibited even from those. Though theoretically, if you have a wedding, that might technically be against what is allowed in the restricted covenant, or if you turn that immoral or.
I lived in Carson in the 60s, and the local legion there had a liquor license permit.
Part-time on weekends, okay to drink? Is that what you're saying?
Well, the license that you get, say, when you're having a wedding.
Oh, I
Yes,
see.
sir.
This,
Religion on the south end of town, outside.
in the town of Raymond, the Eagles Hall serves alcohol. Same methodology. which is that the provincial legislation restricted standing licenses, but not special event licenses. And so the Eagles Hall of Raymond applies for 365 licenses in advance. And it's more expensive to do that way, and it's more paperwork to do it that way, but they can then sell out any day of the week. And so, yeah, I like Prohibition, but only.
That's some serious cheating. George. Did any Mormon communities in the same style get planned or built or developed in Montana, or did they get skipped altogether as people came to Alberta?
That's a great question. To my knowledge, there are none. Sort of leapfrog. There are Mormon settlements as far south as Mexico, and people went to Mexico for the same reason they came to Canada, which was to avoid prosecution for polygamy. And so you can find that pattern in Mexico, Arizona, and basically all the way up through Utah, Idaho. To my knowledge, then there's a gap. There's none in Montana, and then it carries on in southern Alberta. That said, there are some elements of the Mormon settlement pattern that show up there. And there's, sorry, I was going to say the name of the man who published a book, and I've totally blanked on it just in this moment. But there's a man who published a book documenting the Mormon settlement style, and it's the same criteria that was used to designate Sterling as a national historic site. And there's about 10 things on the list, and so to my knowledge, nobody used like the plat of Zion, which is just one of those things on the list. But there are other elements in the way that they conducted agriculture that either may have been brought by Mormons or just sort of transferred because of proximity to Mormon communities.
It's like places like Raymond, you plots for 10 acres that everybody basically be self-sufficient, you know, at that time, 10 acres probably support, you know, at least in terms of, you know, a little bit of livestock, you know, vegetables, things like that.
Does that still actually happen?
Yeah, sort of. So Sterling, which is designated as a national historic site, the blocks were 10 acres, the lots were 2.5 acres. So you have a quarter block lot, which was enough for like an outbuilding and some livestock and a big garden. And Sterling no longer subdivides any of those original still standing quarter block lots still exist. And their land use bylaw still allows you to have certain types of livestock. Raymond is completely loose. We just reintroduced urban hens, but there were decades where you weren't allowed to have anything resembling livestock within the town. Sterling, and you'll see it as well in Hill Spring, Glenwood, some of the smaller villages and hamlets, you still see evidence of that traditional style, which was to have a big garden and livestock and everything. Growing up in Sterling, it was very prevalent when I was a kid. Like my parents had horses in the backyard. We had a huge garden, and we weren't the only ones. I could walk through the community and see cows and goats and horses throughout town.
Belinda?
We've always had the myth that it was illegal for foreigners to live in Blackridge because we had a bylaw. No such bylaw exists, but the myth still continues. Your presentation suggests even more to me that it was a choice for many not to move to Blackridge because you couldn't escape alcohol.
Yes. Yeah.
So Belinda's comment, for those of you on Zoom, is that there's a myth that Mormons were not allowed to live in Lethbridge, but the research presented suggests that it was more of a choice rather than restriction. Stewart?
Yeah, that restricted covenant almost feels like a direct response to, it's not just Lethbridge, but sort of mining community, what grows up around you. So yeah, you're right. I think it probably did in place for many Mormons that era to live. That is, there is a congregation established, and a little after the turn of the century, you start to see. So, for example, the Ellison Mill started as a Raymond milling company, and the Ellison family, had come from Utah to Raymond, and then made their way to Lethbridge, and then a group of Latter-day Saints sort of builds around that. But I don't know if you've dug at this topic. I've dug in it. I found no evidence of any restriction around living in Lethbridge, and I think it's a convenient fact that many of these communities are about 10 miles away or 20 miles away or whatever the number is, and that's just a coincidence. It's not really. There's nothing there that restricts them.
Genesis, do we have any questions for online? No. Okay. George, you're full of questions today.
I'm sorry, I hate to monopolize the conversation. I just wonder, sounds kind of like smooth sailing, but I wonder if along the way there must have been some friction, when certainly maybe not when the communities were being established because there's a like-mindedness, but as other people maybe considered moving to these towns and villages, if there was friction regarding prohibition.
So the question is, has there ever been any friction for people who moved into these small communities and the prohibition and the lack of liquor?
Yes, for sure. Certainly as demographics have changed. And that's why you see the question coming up in Karsten in 2014, in Raymond in 2020. We're kind of at a point in these communities where I don't know the actual numbers, but I would suggest that Raymond probably isn't majority membership of the Latter-day Saint faith. That it's somewhere close to 50-50, but not an overwhelming majority like it had in the past. And it was quite divisive that in 2020, or I guess 2021, when it came up. They had these town halls, and people were quite civil, or tried to be quite civil, but there was a lot of tension in the room as the topic was discussed. And I don't know if that's, I can look back in my life, the question had never come up before because it was not really a feasible option up until recently. But now that it's kind of become a feasible option, then it's reignited the debate, maybe a debate that has never existed.
About bootlegging and those kinds of things that probably happen.
Yeah, I've read a few early articles in the paper about bootlegging from certain businesses where they were selling that, if you knew they had it, then you could get it. I'm sure that has gone on throughout the entire history of this communities. Anywhere prohibition exists, bootlegging exists.
Are you related to Wally Foss?
Am I related to Wally Foss for the Zoom viewers? I don't think so.
Wally, you know who Wally was?
I don't.
I think it was the equipment with EFRA when they built the St. Mary Dam.
Okay, go on.
And the Archaeological Society has a beach out there. It's called Wally's Beach. And the water goes down and it erodes away. They find all these airlanes and camel tracks and all that.
So, you asking this, Wally Foss, you asking this question reignited my uncle-in-law is Gordy Zobel, who was the RID director, the Raymond Irrigation director for many years. And when he first met me, he said, "Foss, are you related to Wally Foss?" And then he told me about how certain ditches were referred to as Foss's Folly because of how poorly designed it was. So I don't know if I'm related or not.
I feel like that's a good solid 7 out of 10 for a no. Does anyone else have any more questions before we start to wrap up? Yes.
Yeah, just a question. Is the prohibition against other vices, that like things like bingo or lottery tickets or maybe even cannabis habits, is that, I'm guessing that's also being prohibited or still is?
So the question for all our viewers is, does the prohibition include other vices, cannabis, gambling, what else is it you said?
Yeah. Those two.
Cannabis, gambling. There's also, I've always sort of heard that Mormons are prohibited from drinking coffee. So I'm curious as to how that fits in these other vices and would that be broad strokes of immoral activity?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Like the wording of that restricted covenant certainly implies that those things would all be included. I've never seen any discussion of that. Like I was on town council actually when the Cannabis Act was changed, and so we were bound by that to outline areas where cannabis could be produced or sold in the community, which created a stir and a lot of anger towards us as a town council, when really we were just doing what was required of us originally. So there certainly has been that, but like pool hall, there's a long history of pool halls in Raymond, like right from the beginning. And maybe they would say, well, we weren't gambling, but I'm sure there were certain aspects to that. There's never been a prohibition to coffee or tea or any of those things.
Where did that come from?
Well, Mormonism does have a prohibition against those things, but like a legal prohibition.
So it's more like the religious principles than
Yes.
legal.
Yes, yeah, and I don't know why. I referenced the word listed, which prohibits alcohol or liquor, and it also includes tea and coffee in there. But it just didn't get the same prohibition fervor that the other things did, and that likely has to do with larger towns that sort of made it easier to move on some of these things. Yeah, none that I've heard of, for sure.
I feel like the very broad strokes of immoral activity also gave you a lot of leeway to say, well, to find loopholes. Go ahead now.
Let's just hope that CPR never really does understand that they could inherit all that land. If they
Yeah.
could get you guys to drink alcohol.
And they could just like,
Or any
Catch
immoral
you.
activity.
Yeah.
I watched, something on Netflix that maybe I shouldn't, but now the CPR lost my property.
well, thank you, Stewart. It's been fascinating actually for somebody who is almost a complete outsider in this area, to have no information about prohibition in regulated parks, et cetera. Thank you for such an informative and detailed presentation. And thank you all for joining us for our first in-person meeting. We will continue with in-person meetings throughout the rest of this season. We are also tossing around the idea of doing something special for holidays. So watch for those sort of announcements on our Facebook, our newsletter, by email. Keep an eye out for all of those sorts of things. And there's books and memberships and a few more steps left. So please help yourselves. We have the room for another 20 minutes. If you'd like to stay and visit. I'm just gonna put the light on.